Hello and welcome to MAAWG5, a video series of short interviews with leaders and experts on prominent issues and emerging threats across our industry. Today's call is going to focus on NIS2, Article 28. And for those that don't know what this is, it is a new EU law that is aimed at enhancing the security of network and information systems across the EU. Specifically, we'll be addressing its impact on the redaction of who-is records by domain name registrars. Article 28 is designated to address challenges that have persisted since the implementation of the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, since 2018. Who-is records, which used to actually be publicly accessible, are now often redacted. And this has made it more difficult for cybersecurity professionals to track down domain registrants and identify those that are engaging in illicit online activities. Ensuring accurate information about domain registrants which is beneficial to users is crucial to preventing cybercrime. And according to NIS2 directive, timely access to domain name registration data by legitimate stakeholders is essential for preventing and combating DNS abuse, as well for the detection and response to security incidents. I'm Dennis Damon, the co-chair of the Public Policy Committee, and I am joined today by Margie Millam and Lauren Wessinger. Thank you for being here, Margie and Lauren. I appreciate you being a part of this. Let's start with some introductions. Margie, can you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, I'm Margie Millam, and I'm the IP enforcement and DNS policy lead at Meta. I've been at Meta for about 7 years now and focus on domain name issues, and in particular, protecting our platform against fraud and abuse. And that's why who-is issues are so important to us.
Oh, I bet. Well, thank you for being here. Lauren, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yes, hello. So my name is Lauren Wessinger, and I teach at Tufts University in the computer science department. I focus on a variety of topics, including risk, as well as cybercrime and abuse. Unsurprisingly, before before Tufts, I was also working for Yale Law School and Fresenius Digital Technology, which is part of the kind of big healthcare conglomerate. And I'm an expert advisor to MAAWG, and I'm also active in other kind of security forums, such as FIRST and APWG.
Well, wonderful, wonderful. Well, as you can tell, we have a great set of speakers here today. I mean, you know, we're celebrating our 20th year here at MAAWG, so I understand a lot of what's happening here, but I want to hear from our folks today here and understand a little bit about what's happening. So, Lauren, let's start with you. Why does who-is continue to be relevant within our area?
Okay, so who-is essentially does give you something if it works and it's not redacted, and that is data, information you can use. So no matter if you're like doing data analysis, or you're trying to understand what's going on in the DNS, if you're doing investigations, tracing like a criminal scheme, any bit of information that you can find is useful. So in the who-is, traditionally, not all the information was necessarily always, pointing to the correct person or was indeed correct, but you still had a data point. To give you an example, an email address might appear in kind of multiple records, right? And you could say, okay, there's a pretty high likelihood that somehow, right, the people behind this are connected. But even if, for example, the names or whatever else might be incorrect. So it is a useful starting point for cyber investigations. If you have that type of information going around, it helps you with kind of tracing architectures, what's going on, and also kind of attribution. And last but not least, as I was saying, as a researcher, obviously, it just gives you a lot of insight and data into kind of the overall DNS and what's going on.
All right, that's a wonderful answer. So considering that, this is coming out of the EU, I'd like to ask you as well, NIS2, what is it? And how is it relevant to our members here at MAAWG today?
Yes, so NIS2 is an EU directive, which means that we're currently in the process of this actually being turned into national law, which is, into national law, not international law. And so this is something that we're actually tracking. So NIS2 amends NIS1. Essentially, it versus NIS. And it is about kind of increasing the level of cybersecurity in the European Union. It specifically targets entities that are fitting into what their definition of critical infrastructure is. But with NIS2, what's important, we're also seeing it kind of push into like key digital service providers. Arguably, they're critical infrastructure themselves. So here, we see a lot of things kind of going on, actually. So things like establish kind of certs and CSerts. There's security requirements for businesses that essentially fall under this realm of, kind of critical infrastructure and key digital services. And we see this both like on a more technical end, but also when it comes to like the more information security or managerial aspects, like doing proper risk management, having a proper kind of security program in place.
Okay. Margie, do you happen to know about, if there's any sort of like unique requirements under, NIS2 right now that you can talk to us about?
Sure, and I'm going to focus specifically on the domain name issues, because what was really interesting about NIS2 is that it regulated this whois information that Lauren was talking about for the first time, and it actually requires registries and registrars and privacy and proxy providers to collect, maintain, verify, and disclose whois information. And they specify specific areas of what kinds of information that is. So it's the registrant's name, it's their email address, it's their phone number, and administrative contacts. And that's really interesting because it enables cybersecurity professionals to actually contact registrants, or, as Lauren was saying, identify them as bad actors and try to take action. And so this information is also available in a database that the registrars and the registries maintain, and it's going to be available in some limited format, similar to what we saw in the past. So, for example, the information for legal entities, that data should be public because it doesn't create any kind of personal information, concerns, and that's expressed in the regulation or in the directive. It also requires the information to be available on disclosure, so you could ask for it to be disclosed for legitimate purposes, such as cybersecurity investigations. And so that's the really interesting angle on this. And as Lauren mentioned, in the past, the whois information has been very inaccurate at times. Well, it actually imposes accuracy requirements and verification requirements. So as a cybersecurity professional, this is really great news, that these obligations will now be part of the framework within Europe. And available to assist in identifying bad actors involved in phishing and malware and fraud.
Wonderful. Well, that's awesome to hear, actually. And I think, as many people here know, MAAWG is not just an organization that likes to get together and have a couple of panels and discussions, but we like to submit our thoughts and our comments to a lot of these processes, because we are a subject matter expert group and we are a working group. So, Lauren, I was hoping you can tell us as well, like a lot of our members may not know this, but MAAWG has actually been submitting comments on this, on how it might help and impact abuse mitigation procedures. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of like the letter that M3 has submitted, actually?
Yes, absolutely. So before I do that, I should note that both Margie and I, as well as a number of other people, including people present here, have been working on this. So there hasn't just been like one thing we've been doing, but there has been a process here. But let's focus on the kind of recent stuff. So as I was mentioning before, so NIS2 is like at the EU level, and then it gets turned into kind of national law, and that's where we currently are in the process. So to kind of help with that, right, MAAWG has been kind of submitting a letter with kind of like recommendations to the EU countries where this process is taking place, and that kind of is specifically focused on, the whois and the whois data. We call it whois data all the time. I mean, technically, to whois is deprecated, but that's what everyone uses. So we kind of do the same, right? And as Margie was already mentioning, right, like in the past, whois, at least in theory, gave you accurate information about the registrant. And these data were available, and then essentially they kind of went away under EU GDPR, which kind of makes a lot of sense considering what's in that law. But what happened is that we saw kind of a blanket redaction, as Margie was referring to before as well. So not just, did we remove data from like organizations that she was mentioning, but there was no kind of scheme established, kind of like a trusted access program or something like that. But now with NIS2, there is now a legal basis for kind of whois number one, involving correct, accurate, verified information on the one hand, and also that these data need to be kind of disclosed for cybersecurity investigations. However, as things often are, both in technology as well as in law and politics, the devil is in the details. And it's about, okay, how are these things kind of actually happening? And in this case, for example, who or what counts as, a proper person you can kind of give this information to, or what, like in terms of like what cases are kind of required for that to actually happen. And Margie can give us more details about that.
Yeah, no, actually, that's actually a good segue, because as they always say, hot off the presses, right? There's been some new information that's just popped up almost 24 hours ago before we decided to put this together. So Margie, can you tell us a little bit about what you just learned about the EU's cooperation group and some guidelines?
Yeah, it's really interesting what happened this week. So because the domain name issues are such a unique area, the European Union put together, they call it a cooperation group, but it was basically regulators from all the different member states that have specialization and understanding in domain name issues. And they came together to provide guidelines on how to implement NIS2 in the member state law. And so what we found was that this week, there was guidelines published, and this is essentially meant to tell the member states how you should implement the NIS2. And it applied specifically just to Article 28, which is the whois provisions that we've been talking about. And I'm really excited to report that some of those guidelines track several of the issues that MAAWG raised in these letters. So I'll just give you a couple examples of that. In the MAAWG letter, MAAWG encouraged the adoption of best practices that were followed by the CCTLD registries, which typically in Europe provide additional levels of verification and monitoring of abuse, so that their abuse rates tend to be lower than in the GTLD space, in the .com, .net, and those sorts of domain names. And so what we saw in the guidelines is that they actually picked up on some of those verification requirements, which include something called identity verification. So this is basically confirming that the name of the entity that's registered the domain name, whether that is actually them. And this is a big step because identity verification is not something that we've typically seen in the GTLD world right now. And it went even beyond that. It followed what some CCTLDs provide, which is when a domain name is reported for abuse, that there would be prompt removal or deactivation of that domain name if it's being used for malicious purposes. And so I think from a MAAWG perspective that, seeing that they were willing to follow the lead of CCTLDs is really a positive development, because we all know that cyber criminals do not put their real information in whois records. And so from, across the board, we will see false information. And when it's false, that gives another takedown tool that you can go to, the registries and registrars that host domain names that may be malicious. So think of phishing and malware and other types of imposter domains, and try to get that taken down. So that will be a new tool in the arsenal for all of the investigators that are here at MAAWG. And then the other thing it did was the MAAWG letter had recommended a shorter time period for these disclosures, as I mentioned earlier. The original language was 72 hours, and MAAWG pointed out that that might not work for urgent requests. Well, the guidelines actually reduced the response time from 72 hours to 24 hours for urgent requests. So again, that's a really a great development, and it's nice to see that the work done by MAAWG gets picked up by the regulators in Europe.
Yeah, no, this is really great news for us, as an organization, because the hard work that members like you two put into this. On more than one occasion, we've had regulators, whether here in the U.S. or abroad in the EU, have made reference to a lot of our comments and documentation, and include some of our best practices. So this is really great for us. But that now brings sort of the question up, and Lorna, I'd like to start with you on this. Once this NIS2 is implemented, how do MAAWG members then begin to adjust their mitigation tactics or their investigations now?
I think so. But when we talk about that, I think we first have to talk about big picture a little bit more, right? So we see that governments around the world are taking kind of cybersecurity aspects and issues kind of more seriously. And we see more and more laws coming out regarding security, but also privacy and kind of adjacent topics. So especially if you're critical infrastructure, if you're critical service, there's a lot going on. You kind of need to keep track of, and both from my kind of professional experience, right, working for a company, as well as from a researcher's perspective, who kind of takes a little bit of a different view on this. I'm hearing and seeing that a lot of people are struggling right now, right, to figure out, okay, what's out there, what is coming, what does it actually mean to us, and in a lot of cases, how do we kind of actually turn something let's say NIS2 that we know about into kind of actionable pieces that we can kind of deal with, right? And most organizations, frankly, do not have the kind of resources, time, and people to deal with this. So you need to be pretty large to actually be able to just have the resources available to do all of this. What I hope will help us is the fact that good security practice is not something that changes, once you kind of cross the border between the US or Canada, or you step on a plane and you fly over to Europe, right? Things like ISO 27001 or NIS 853. They're still good documents, even if you're not being audited according to those, or you're not in the US. So there's a lot there that need to be followed. However, globally speaking, right? We know cybersecurity and cybercrime is a big issue, and with all the developments that are kind of going on right now, and risks that are kind of emerging, be this around kind of AI and machine learning, or other things that are kind of up and coming, we probably just do need kind of more more investment to kind of meet the regulations, but also meet kind of relevant security goals that businesses have. And my hope is also that more work will be kind of done in bridging, the kind of high level requirements, and helping people who are kind of dealing with operations to kind of get to, okay, and this is roughly what we have to do, right? There's a lot of specificity involved all the time, but there's still the chance for better guidance. And that is also something that MAAWG happens to be kind of involved in, right? With best practices and working groups and so on. And one of them is obviously the policy working group that looks specifically at kind of what's coming into regulation and legal spheres and what to do about that.
Yeah. Marcia, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I can get a little more granular on how it affects investigations, because we should see a noticeable change in information because of this public nature of some of the data. I think members should kind of go back to practices that they did, pre-GDPR, where they would check the who is first, because you may very well find this information is already there, and it would be more than the technical information we see today. It would be the name of the registrant and their contact information, especially if they are a legal person. And to the extent you see any inaccuracies in that information, it would actually be positive to go to the registrar and registry and let them know, because that triggers additional obligations to re-verify the information. So that should be a step in everyone's toolbox. Then if the information is not public because it involves personally identifiable information, then you should make a formal request to the registries and the registrars that have the data. And also keep in mind that this also applies to privacy and proxy providers. And so, as many of you may know, sometimes the information is covered under additional layer of that doesn't enable you to find out who the registrant is, but you can go to the privacy or proxy provider and ask them for that information, citing your legitimate interest, which in this case for the most MAAWG members would be, cybersecurity investigations. That's the type of information that they registrar or registry might need in order to disclose that information. And then finally, as you think about this, currently, many of you may go to hosting providers to ask for content to be taken down, but if it involves a malicious domain name, you should make the additional step of going to the domain name registrar or the domain name registry, because when they receive notice of the malicious domain names, that it would trigger, if these guidelines are adopted by the member states, it would actually trigger an additional identity verification. So that's a really great news, that it triggers the verification, and then you can ask finally for the removal or deactivation of the domain name if it's malicious and the information's incorrect. So all of this will give most of these cybersecurity professionals additional tools to be able to mitigate the types of malicious activity that NIS is trying to prevent and avoid.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Well, listen, as we're coming up to our time here, I want to just throw one last question here towards you, Lauren. And that question is like, what can MAAWG members do right now in terms of like, how to stay up to date today, what's going on, and things like that?
Yeah, so I think as with everything, right, that you want to do, you probably have to invest some time and resources in that. And one way of doing that, though, in a effective and efficient manner, is to kind of stay up to date through using MAAWG or other security fora to kind of see what is going on, right, and get not just the oh, this is like the headlines, but some people are actually looking into this and like reading through. So for example, like the public policy meeting that is happening regularly, we have updates from relevant regions and discussions about essentially kind of like what is going on. And often what happens too, and what will be happening at next meeting, and has happened at many meetings before, is that when something important comes up, there will also be kind of panels or other sessions about these things. I mean, the second thing is probably as well, like you need to kind of track relevant laws and regulations internally, because it's not just, oh, is this there, but also does it apply to you? And if it applies to you, in what way, shape, and form? So one of these that is relatively simple and can happen is that, something might apply to like a specific domain, healthcare, banking, whatever. But if you're a service provider to an organization that is covered, you might also be covered because you are a service provider to that organization. So that's something to watch out for, and unfortunately, something where MAAWG or entities like it cannot kind of do the work for you. And last but not least, I think we really have to go back to, if you have kind of good security and you're following best practices, that always helps. And that helps you with all the kind of regulations and laws out there. So essentially, maintain good risk management, information security management, keep track of your privacy, have proper controls, make sure they're working. And you're probably already kind of more than half the way there for sure to be compliant.
That is true. That is true. Well, listen, I want to thank everyone today for their time, especially to you, Margie and Lauren. This has been a really wonderful conversation on the NIS2 article 28 comments that MAAWG has been submitting. I want to tell everybody, stay tuned for more MAAWG5s. They're coming out pretty regularly. And feel free to reach out through us through our contact us form if you want to suggest any topics or any sort of guests that we could have here. But again, Margie and Lauren, thank you for being here today.
You're welcome.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.